Okay, well, welcome everybody. Steve and I have known one another for several years. Actually, gee, Steve, I think it's been 20 years. But
It's been 20 years. It's been over 20 years. Try 23.
you know what's important, and everybody can see the slide that says who. So who are these guys? Let's start off by saying that number one, the two of us have actually been in business for a period of time before going back and getting advanced degrees and doing academia. And even after that, we've continued to engage businesses across a wide spectrum of industries, uh, whether it happens to be talking about supply chains, talking about sustainability, or really how those two topics intersect.
Yeah, and it's been interesting because both of us, like I said, had industry experience, and I think back to when I was putting, and I don't know that I was putting two and two together at the time, but I was a plant manager and I was working at a facility running a plant down in southern Florida, and we had terrific trash bills that were eating us alive, and we started looking at it, and a lot of the stuff that when we'd done a dumpster dive, turns out were totally recyclable, probably 80% of the materials. And that's when it first started dawning on me that, hey, there's a lot of value in this waste stream here, and there's a lot of value that we can recover. And that's kind of guided my thinking since. And you can see, certainly from my background, I think the science has played a role in my coverage of this topic area, as you'll see during the course of the presentation. And one of the things I'm working hard at our university, we're one of the leaders, literally in the U.S., on environment and social issues change at the campus level, in terms of making it a topic that students understand. And so we're looking at it, and I certainly approach it from an entrepreneurial point of view, hence the Sam Walton affiliation for me. Rich?
Except I can't see my notes. We're still having a couple of technical difficulties at this end.
Okay, well, can we just go to the next screen? I'll go ahead and keep talking, jump in when you can. All right.
Is this slide okay? You got to tell me when.
No, let's go to the next slide. Next slide.
Okay, thanks.
And like I said, you can see from that previous one, Rich has had a tremendous amount of experience in the area. He was in the chemical industry for a long time, dealing with a lot of these issues firsthand. But I wanted to get to what are we talking about today? I mean, in a sense, these are the topics that we want to get after, because there's a lot of misuse in the term, and we think certainly in the recycling arena, one of the messages we'd like to get across today is this concept of the holistic thinking and looking at the whole supply chain. And so that's where we're going to talk. And a number of these issues do tend to come into play. And so if we do that, I mean, I think about it, I'm working with a number of firms, for example, now that are being inundated, literally buried by requests for information by customers and even suppliers upstream, and they're being done in the name of supplier sustainability audits. And these audits are starting to ask for a lot of questions, and they're asking for things such as their energy use, their water use. They even go so far, a number of them, to ask for employment practices, level of diversity in the company, and a number of things like this. It's very reminiscent to me of the quality movement. If some of you can remember back then, a lot of the quality movement started out that way. People started sending out, questions. They wanted to know about your quality program, what you were doing, and the challenge became everybody had a little bit different questionnaires, and it ended up taking up so much time internally to either initially to dig up the information they were doing, but also to fill out the forms, and there was no standard format for doing it. And a lot of this is the same, we're replaying history in this area of sustainability, and there's not a set format yet. Probably one of the more interesting ones that's out there that you certainly want to go look at is Walmart's, mainly because of their clout and their size and the number of suppliers. They've got over 100,000 suppliers in that company, and they initiated a couple years ago a supplier sustainability audit, and it initially consisted of about 15 questions to get firms thinking about this. They haven't gone so far as to say they're not going to, use you if you can't fill it out, but they certainly hinted at it. But the other thing they've done is they just recently, about a week or two ago, announced they're going to a much more intensive format. It's going to have more than 100 questions for people to answer if they want to do business with Walmart. And so these are the kind of things that make this area a challenge, and it starts impacting, because one of the things that they start getting interested in is, what is your waste stream? And certainly a lot of times this is not information that's readily available or willingly disclosed, and that's going along at the same time with this incredible movement and demand for this word called transparency. People want to know more. They want to see inside. They want to look under the kimono of what you're doing. And if you combine that again with the rapid changes going on in the social media area, this is creating quite an area of concern for firms, because certainly I work with large firms, I work with medium-sized firms, and even some small ones. And the larger ones certainly can throw a lot more resources at it and can get on top of it. But even now, a lot of them are not quite clear where this is going or why it's going in the direction it's going. And we'll start talking to some of that this afternoon. But it's certainly moving there quickly. And firms, if they're not responsive, can get in trouble in a hurry. Certainly the most recent example has been Apple. They've just been derided with their supply chain. And a lot of it gets flown on the social media is what drives it.
Now, if we look at this topic of supply chain, an epiphany that we frequently encounter is by applying supply chain management to reverse flows, and we're going to see here in a few minutes how the supply chain accomplishes return. Although Steve and I tend to feel that, yeah, well, it mentions return, it probably doesn't do an adequate job of applying supply chain concepts across an entire spectrum of disposition options. So when we ask the question, how do these two interact? That's precisely what we mean. And in preparing the PowerPoints for today, one of the things that we kind of wrestled with is we said, well, look, we're looking at the return and the reverse side of logistics, but we thought that there might be value by expanding this further, and we tried our hand at a new subtitle, and we said, okay, how do we apply supply chain management with the theme of sustainability? So that's essentially where we're going. So Lisa, why don't we go to the next slide?
Well, here's a common definition, and as you're reading this, I think one of the things, this word is obviously overplayed nowadays. It's used, you can't hear a politician or a business PR person, exec, anybody, university, I don't care. This word somehow appears in almost any talk they do. When you get down to it, though, one of the things I know Rich and I firmly believe is that it not only is all the above, the term triple bottom line comes in and others, but essentially what it means is your business is thriving in the future. And to do that, there are a number of things that you need to do to make yourself thrive in the future, and not the least of which is be aware of all the impacts that are potentially coming your way and the risks. I mean, you could literally go back to basic management 101 and look at a SWOT model and apply that to sustainability, and we certainly look at it in that context. And one of the most important things that comes out of this, and the hope that we can convey to you today, is that the economic value is critical in this, and that's one of the areas that's been underplayed and why it is so difficult for people to understand the recycling end of the business. And so that's one of the theme that we're after today.
But if you think about economic sustainability and you look at environmental responsibility, these are not at odds with one another whatsoever. Stephen and I have spent probably the better part of the last 15 years working with firms encouraging them to marry those two concepts, because you can actually do well by doing good, I think is the way it's been phrased.
Right. Okay, next
Go ahead,
slide.
Lee.
Okay, we're gonna throw a couple of models at you. I mean, we wouldn't be good academics if we didn't do that. But essentially, what we kind of want you to understand, there's some history to this, and one of the things I constantly tell people is I said, hey, sustainability doesn't need to be treated as something separate. In fact, this concept fits very nicely with other things that we are very adept at now and very much looking at in most firms. Certainly, the supply chain council came up with the score model probably, boy, it's been what, 20 years ago, and we're going to go through that model in depth, and it kind of lays out nicely over the term sustainability. But also, sustainability fits in very nicely with the lean movement. And the lean movement has been in full swing for some time now. And essentially, I want to talk to people. I mean, lean to me it's a culture, and it's a way of looking at your business. And now we're adding in things such as environmental and social concerns. But in the end, I'm looking at processes, and I'm looking at how I do my work. And life cycle analysis is in a similar vein. That's another term that took on a lot of life now because of this interest in where did everything come from. And we deal with that extensively at the recycling end of the supply chain, because we have to know exactly what's in these things. And we just don't dump stuff anymore, which has been the historical answer to everything. And we can't go on doing that. And so life cycle analysis is a concept that we're going to talk about today as well.
With regard to life cycle analysis, several years ago I was having a discussion with several individuals from the U.S. Navy, and I had used the term cradle to grave, and they pulled me up short and they said, no, it's no longer cradle to grave, it's lust to dust. So you better be thinking about this before you even start to generate any kind of residual. Go ahead, Lisa. Some of you may have been exposed to the SCORE model, others may not. There's a couple of really unique features here. One is that there's a belief that every organization goes through a sourcing process, a make process, and a deliver process with an overarching plan process attached to it. Source basically means, okay, we're out there, we're buying things from other people. And if you look at this, this slide, you'll see that we're buying from a supplier. That supplier has a deliver activity that marries up to our source activity. And that works as well on our customer end, where we're delivering to a customer and that customer has engaged in some kind of source activity. And what's linking those two is make. Now, I've been doing let's say over the last 10 or 12 years, I've been doing a lot with the U.S. military, and I've had a little bit of pushback. I had a Marine major who had responsibility for vehicle maintenance says, wait a minute, I'm a Marine, I fix vehicles, I don't make anything. And I said, sure you do. You start with broken vehicles and you produce usable ones. And he kind of gave me the deer in the headlights look for a minute, and the smile came to his face, and he said, yeah, you're right, I do make stuff, don't I? I said, yeah. Now, the other thing that that is useful to look at is that there are three parallel flows, and also note that these have double-headed arrows, which means that both the physical flow, the information flow, and the financial flow go in two directions. And if you turn the clock back probably maybe even 40 years ago, the concept of physical flow was the emphasis that everybody had if you were in materials management or distribution. It wasn't too long after that, though, that we had organizations say, well, wait a minute, you know, if my information flow isn't working right, my physical flow isn't going to work right either. And information flow is more than the transaction flow. It's also such items as forecasts, It can be information about innovation. It can be information about regulatory compliance. So that whole spectrum of information is necessary in order that physical flow works right. The third one is financial flow. And I've often mused that suppliers are really unusual in that they love to be paid for their goods and services. What tends to hang this up is when there's some disruption to physical flow. I don't get the right quantity, I get the wrong stuff, it comes too late, and when that happens, the physical flow doesn't seem to be working right. So you can actually say at the end of the day, I need the information flow to enable the physical flow, which in turn will enable the financial flow. So when you look at this, that is precisely what we're trying to drive home here, and that is that everyone realizes that all these flows need to be in sync, that our supply chain does have these repeatable activities or functions, and when we start to look at reverse flows, and actually I'm going to show you a slide here in a few minutes that'll actually have one other link in the supply chain, and that'll be the reverse flow.
Yeah, one other note I think I would add to that, Rich, with this model. I think everybody's aware that probably one of the most significant things that's happening here on all three of these fronts is the incredible time compression hitting these. Physical flow, I mean, supply chains have been shortened incredibly over time due to any number of things, you know, changes in transit, changes in docking, loading, things like that. But certainly information flow is instantaneous, and financial now, certainly with the creation of the European market and 24/7 movement of capital, the financial flow is very quick nowadays. So that's another thing that's hammering us on this, is this constant pressure of time.
It's interesting that you're talking about a compressed time because the physical flow actually has, let's say, in the last couple decades, been lengthening, and this winds up also having a real sustainability issue, in that those lengthening supply chains create all sorts of all sorts of havoc. Certainly, it creates more in the terms of tons of carbon produced.
Yeah, and the complexity for sure. And then you might as well, like you say, get into all the things that we've gone into. For example, you know, more JIT type systems, less inventory, more deliveries. Yeah, it's huge impacts.
Okay, go ahead, Lisa.
Okay, number of things here. This is probably where the discussion is going to get a little ugly, but certainly a lot of the environmental problems, as Rich just mentioned, are created at various points in the supply chain, and it kind of ties back to that concept I introduced previously of transparency. Unfortunately, for most of us, the supply chains are not real transparent at this point in terms of information on the materials, and so one of the things we look at here is that these problems are created at various points in the discussion and in the chain. We see that every process that's in that chain, and if you've got a multiply complex process where you're making, doing, shipping at every phase of the supply chain, every process has some kind of yield factor going on. Very rarely you're going to see 100% all the time. I mean, we can talk Six Sigma all day long, but we still got a lot of residuals created in most of the processes. And the challenge is going to be doing the analysis to what's going on here. And as we've mentioned, a caveat that may want to go here with this that makes it incredibly complex has been the whole globalization movement of the supply chains. You've got things being harvested and processed in any number of countries now with varying degrees of environmental and social standards, and trying to keep track of that and measure that and get visibility into that is certainly a major challenge for us.
Okay, next slide. To begin with, we started looking at sources of residuals. We took a small slice of the supply chain. We said, all right, what functions are involved here? And we can include inbound receiving, inspection, storage, materials handling, manufacturing, and distribution. And if you start and look at each one of the categories of generated residuals, you'll find that a lot of these are directly related to supply chain issues. The most often found one happens to be packaging. Packaging that not only protects the product from us, but I come out of the chemical industry, and I think of this as actually protecting us from the product. The other thing that I'll call your attention to is that some of this waste is actually the result of human decisions. An example would be lot sizing. Lot sizing, shelf life, those are not actually physical issues, but those are decision issues that relate to various decision making, whether that decision making deals with an economic driver or deals with a regulatory one. Next slide.
We realize we're burying you with a number of things, but you have copies of this, and you may want to go back and think it through, and certainly be more than happy if you contacted either of us to discuss this further. Next slide. Okay, well, as Rich was saying, I mean, source of residuals, I mean, they come from any number, but certainly supply chain activities, you start looking at the physical activities a little closer. I mean, you start thinking about the information and the physical flows here, and we may want to be looking at this separately, because you start seeing a number of things going on that impact the other, but currently there may or may not be a conversation that goes on, and that comes into on a number of things. I mentioned earlier the plant that I was running, I mean, where I ended up with you know, all kinds of materials at the end in the trash bin that could have been avoided had there been a discussion early on between operations, for example, and the development phase. And that often occurs, and I constantly think of the example I've talked numerous times with students is you know, like the juicy cartons and things that kids have had for a number of years. You know, great, terrific design. You know, it holds it well. It's easy to store. You know, pass out to your kids' teams or whatever. But you can't recycle it because of the way the packaging is made. There's no way to separate the materials, and that's just one example. There's any number of examples that go on where, because this lack of information flow between the outbound, the inbound, and the transformation process, we don't make the right decision. We do it in silos, and we can all think of examples there, but those are a couple. Next slide.
Okay, next slide. I had mentioned earlier that the Supply Chain Council had added a return function, and there you see it. It's right there next to the right below the deliver function. But what's significant here is that the perspective is one that this is where goods are returned from customer to supplier. Such examples as outdated pharmaceuticals being returned from pharmacies to the producer. And yet, there's another dimension of dealing with various kinds of residual materials, and that is that those will actually follow a forward flow as opposed to a reverse flow. I'll give you a couple of examples here. I'm not going to use any proper nouns, but there's a large magazine and book printer not too far from where I'm seated in central Pennsylvania that in one plant turns out 10,000 tons of waste paper a year. Now, to put that into perspective, that's equal to one freight train. They have an entire marketing department that deals with selling waste paper, and it winds up going to mills that produce toilet tissue and paper towels and other kinds of consumer paper. But that's all a forward flow, so we actually would go from a deliver to a source function. Another example, I come out of the chemical industry. I used to buy a very heavy waxy substance called alpha olefin C30+, long chain kind of material. Turns out that one of the oil companies wound up with this as byproduct. didn't want this at all, and they were selling it to me at really a very, very cheap price. Actually, I couldn't get enough of it, and eventually my supplier figured out that they had a bona fide product on their hand, and they increased their price by about tenfold overnight one time, and it was kind of a rude experience. But the fact of the matter is that you can have residuals flowing in both directions. So the fact that we have a double-headed arrow there for physical flow is an appropriate one. Go ahead, Lisa. As we start and drill down into that source, make, and deliver, you'll see that we're identifying really two categories. One is, you know, I'll start with 100% minus my yield factor. It gives me all sorts of, you know, scrap and waste and categories of residuals. But I also wind up with with 4 different kinds of emissions here: water, air, ground, and noise. And a lot of those are, again, the function of the supply chain. The fact that we have inbound transportation, the fact that we have all sorts of packaging attached. So these are very real. Again, I come out of the chemical industry, and you know, we were always very sensitive to the amount of emissions that we had, because everybody was watching our industry long before they were watching lots of others. Go ahead, Lisa.
And here's the more traditional view. We tend to always take a strong look at this internally, particularly on the environmental concerns. As Rich just mentioned, we've got all the usual stuff up above there causing issues for recycling, reuse, reverse logistics. But again, at every step of the way, this emission issue comes into play. And a lot of times, the reason it historically has not been addressed is that it hasn't been put into a cost factor, and it hasn't been substantiated well enough. And because a lot of these things, if you look at them, air and water, certainly noise, and to a lesser extent ground, I mean, these are issues of what's traditionally been called the commons. And that's the area where we all own it, but none of us own it. You know, the ocean, rivers, you know, certainly you hear about, I mean, we hear a lot about the North Pacific Gyre. We know that, or it's more common name, the Pacific Toilet Bowl, where it's full of plastic. But again, for most of us, in a day-to-day thing, you don't see it, it doesn't exist. You go to the beach, hey, there's not much here. But if you've ever been to a beach where you see a lot of plastic wash up, like after a huge storm, like some of these tsunamis that came around, certainly in the Pacific, that washed a lot of plastic up on the beaches in Southern California, where I'm from originally, and that's all of a sudden people are saying, hey, where does stuff come from? But it is a case of we have to start becoming more and more aware of the impact that we're having on these at each step in the way. Next slide. And as we see, again, even on the deliver and return side, we end up with the same exact issues. And again, we're just trying to make that point here as we go through, that these often get passed along. And you know, with the suppliers, the carriers, the product, if it's not made well at one phase and it becomes damaged, worn out at the next, it's not accepted, it has to be returned. But again, same thing, if it's not a clean process and we don't demand a clean process throughout the chain, we end up with the same emissions issues going all the way down and through. Next slide.
Okay, sustainable procurement. You know, I don't mean to necessarily be singling out the procurement people here, but this function within an organization is the one that I often think as being on the pointy end of the supply chain within the firm, because a lot of the decisions made come out of here when we are dealing with inbound materials and services. But consider for a moment how many organizations, maybe not the Fortune 100, but a lot of organizations still use the metric for a procurement function of what's referred to as purchase price variance. In other words, I used to buy something for $1, I can now purchase it for 75 or for 95 cents, and therefore I tend to be a hero. That discounted price winds up being one of the all-time favorite ways to measure procurement activity, and yet what I'm seeing is a lot of different thinking, certainly among the leading firms, but the small to medium-sized firms are still living in that particular paradigm. Next slide. In creating a procurement cycle, you need to start with how you specify materials, and once you can do that, you have an understanding of what your requirements happen to be. But from there, identify who potential suppliers are, go through a vetting process to select those, and come to some commercial agreement with what you want them to do. And if you look at those green boxes there, I also have referred to those as the transaction phase. Probably one of the least value-added activities within the supply chain. It's highly clerical. What you do in that phase is really not going to be of any consequence if you want to start and deal with either source reduction or source elimination. Go ahead, Lisa. We took that same slide and we added one other note, and that's in that upper right-hand corner. After we've gotten done with the purchase itself, we need to control the inventories and we need to assess the experience. But what we're saying there is that we need to do supplier audits. And at the end of the day, did we really achieve everything that we had as an objective? Did we have suppliers that were endeavoring to reduce waste on our behalf? And I'll give you just a quick story about one. I'm going to go back to the example of my large printer. They're always looking for ways to reduce costs, and they had a supplier come to them and they said, look, you buy these master rolls of paper. In order to protect that paper better from potential damage, what we're going to do is we're going to wrap every roll of that. Now these are jumbo rolls, they weigh over a ton. But we're going to wrap every one of those rolls in an asphalt-coated paper to protect it. And the printing firm said, if you do, we'll cut you off. We'll cut you off because the reason being is that we now have to find a different way to dispose of that wrapper, which has now been coated with asphalt. Whereas the previous wrapper, which was uncoated, we could put into our regular residual flows, and that wound up actually being sold to the consumer goods company that I mentioned earlier. Lisa?
Next slide. Well, here's a term that you may be familiar with, or maybe not, but it's a very important one in this context that we're talking. Design for environment. It's often said that design is the first signal of human intent. In other words, how we design something, basically saying what we care about the rest of the process, or don't care, would probably be a better way of looking at it. Because you think about some of the things that you've seen in our lifetime, some of the products. I mean, I certainly look at cars and engines and things. I grew up working on engines and cars, and you pretty much, I used to reuse, fix, do anything in the engine, and nowadays I can't touch it, and it's a black box to me, and that's a movement in a lot of ways. You could argue in the wrong direction, but in another way, if you're taking into account the environment, I can also remember when we used to dump motor oil down the sewer, and again, not a thing to do now. But again, design has lots of cost implications, which is where we wanted to go. And if you start looking at some of these comments that we've made here, that certainly waste is a resource that's in the wrong place. Another way of saying that is one firm's waste is another firm's raw material, which starts closing the loop. You hear the term closed loop supply chains. Well, that's exactly what the implication is. And recycling and reuse is a reaction to the fact that we've got waste at the end of the line. And whereas if we go after elimination or reduction of that waste, that's more of a proactive approach, which is what we're advocating. And then that gets you all the way to this concept of cradle to cradle, where you're thinking completely differently than cradle to grave. Next slide.
Actually,
again, here's pardon?
Let me just weigh in on that last one. Lisa, keep the slide where it is. But while Steve was confessing to dumping motor oil going down the storm sewer, I can also tell you that at various points in my early career, I was the one who signed off for the disposal of polychlorinated biphenyl. So I haven't had any subpoenas yet, but they could have been out there.
Yeah, that's interesting, because you can almost think of any business. We've all done that where things were dumped that nowadays you just cringe at. But I guess one of the ways we started looking at this again, I mean, it's easiest if you eliminate things at the top. If we get very proactive by designing a better product and looking at it from that context, that's very preemptive on the procurement end, and that has to do again with our choice of suppliers. It could be because it may be the people we're working with come up with the idea. But certainly that's the least of our worries if we can eliminate the waste way up front, so we don't have to deal with a product where we're having to handle something that requires special handling or disposition. And then each step of the way, as you can see as you go down, various other characteristics start entering in, and you start realizing that at some point, certainly in the reuse and recycling, there is residual value, but we have to find out what that is and where we can get rid of it. And I'm thinking, a very common one for a lot of us is shrink wrap. You think about the amount of shrink wrap that goes into a lot of firms, almost any pallet that comes in, and what do you do with the shrink wrap? And that's a constant challenge. Do we save it? Do we have a place to take it? Who does that? I had a group of students that came up with a project up here in the valley, and they're working with a firm to do literally a milk run between a number of manufacturing facilities up here, collecting the shrink wrap and taking it into a firm that could use it and actually do something with it. And it's along the same lines. We've got a major company down here. It's got an aluminum smelter, and then they also have the manufacturing facilities located at the same place. And everywhere in the facilities, they're collecting. They've got a lot of scrap coming off from each stage of the manufacturing process, but they capture that. Then they take the aluminum literally back across the street and keep reusing it. And they've got it up to where now the majority of the aluminum that's going in is recycled, and that's huge. And then just simple things that impact you here. Certainly, your disposition options start getting limited if there becomes disposal bans or products that are banned from being moved, disposed of, or have to be handled in a certain way, or certainly, as in the case in the EC, when you get take-back laws, now all of a sudden your thinking is going to start changing very differently if you had a take-back law and you're required to handle it. The simple version of that, where it's more voluntary, as you think about, certainly in the United States, look at the cartridge stores for little inkjet print cartridges and how that's sprung up. In terms of a way of, so we don't have to use so many new inkjet cartridges. It's actually become a business, and most of the firms are into that now, even the traditional ones. Next slide. Here's the concept of life cycle analysis, and in each stage of the supply chain, we start looking in, and we're trying to identify what goes on in pre-production, production, distribution, utilization. Let me give you an example that may help you visualize this one. Just think of a hamburger. And if you were asked to look at the life cycle of a hamburger, what's that going to start looking like? And you sit there and you think, oh, well, that's simple. It's got a bun. It's got some lettuce, pickles, ketchup, mustard, and the meat. Well, okay, that's great. That now we've identified the products. But if you start looking at the life cycle, what went on in each phase of those, and you start going back to each of those individual products, what did it take to get the bread? Well, you probably sourced that from a bun company. Well, what did they do? Well, they've got ovens. They're contracting with somebody to get the wheat and whatever else they're mixing in with that. How was the wheat grown? You start going back to all these phases. And then certainly on the meat one is the most insidious in the hamburger in terms of you start going back up the chain and you end up typically at a cattle feedlot if it's beef, and and then all the grain that it takes to go in there, what kind of water did it take to grow the grain, and all these things. And that's where you start looking and you start realizing the impact because of the feedlots. The secondary impact is that we've all heard it. It's the cows and the methane production impacting the atmosphere. And so we don't even think about that. And then if you start getting down into utilization, you and I are eating the hamburgers that we so much like, but if we do that too much, part of the life cycle analysis has to be the cost of a population that's eating so much beef, and what does it do to your health long term? So when you're looking at these life cycles, there's oftentimes a lot of things that come into play that we don't typically think about. Next slide, please. So again, we're back to the slide of we start looking at disposition options and costs, and you start looking at the comparing the opportunities for the sale of scrap and avoiding landfill costs versus the proactive thing of not generating it to begin with. And then in the same context, you got to ask that question all the way up the chain. What do we know about our suppliers? What are they doing? What are they landfilling? What's that adding to their cost, which I obviously pay for at some point? So this is where, again, we're really advocating this holistic view of the chain, because you realize these costs that are being incurred at different phases that up until now we didn't pay any attention to, we realize are starting to very severely, in some cases, start impacting the cost of the product to me. And how I deal with it, it's very interesting. I mean, you think about it. How do you do this, and how do you collect this information? And that's a huge challenge in this day and age. And how this stuff is stored and accounted for, and that's where it goes back to the transparency and the desire to collect this stuff in supplier sustainability audits. And again, you're looking at firms that, hey, I want to look at the ones that are doing the proactive steps, the source elimination, the source reduction. I really want to get after that. Next slide.
Actually, I'll just make one comment on that previous slide, but Lisa, you don't have to change this at all. One of the issues that you saw there as far as a cost was concerned was administrative overhead. This is the cost of making those decisions. This is the cost of collecting information or collecting data and turning it into information, doing the analysis. There is a cost associated with it. It's not free, but it still needs to be recognized. I had mentioned several slides ago about the Navy correcting me and referring to lust to dust. The key point here is that we need to think about materials from the point of harvest or extraction to the point of disposition. And one of the things I do when I do a graduate seminar in supply management is I actually have students look around the room and I said, all right, you tell me something that that wasn't either harvested or extracted, and can you identify it? And of course the word is no. I said, all right, now take a look around and tell me what will not wind up in a disposal or a disposition stream at some point. Again, we look around the room and the answer is no. The difference is time. So what's one firm's waste is another one's raw material, but you need to be smart enough to recognize it, number one, but number two, understand the costs that are involved in collection, processing, sales, marketing, what have you. Making products merely less bad is still suboptimal. I still have that conversation with several firms, but less bad can mean all sorts of things to different people. In some cases, less bad means, well, maybe a little less expensive to deal with, and therefore it's attractive. Steve and I advocate a goal-driven approach. In other words, what are the goals that you plan to achieve? And I might add, if I had to put a subtitle on that, how do I even communicate those to the other members of my supply chain? But then certainly develop the tools and metrics to measure any progress. With that, I would also say to measure, you need to better understand what procurement means, get away from purchase price variance, and get your arms around all of the costs that are related to a particular acquisition. In some quarters, this is also called total cost of ownership. Actually, before I head down that stream, let me just say, when we look at life cycle costs, do we have the ability to look that far in the future for a very long-term asset? Lisa, go ahead. Next slide.
That's a terrific lead into this next slide, because essentially one of the things that you start realizing when you're looking at life cycle is I may not be capturing all the relevant costs. If I'm, and again, this may be somewhat elementary, but if I'm just looking at price, that may not tell the story. Because again, remember, if you think way back early on, we talked about the commons. Right now, it's very difficult to price things that are in the commons, such as the air and the water. But at some point, governments and localities are starting to crack down more on this in their landfill costs, the availability of landfill, for example, and certainly, air restrictions. You look at the in the U.S., it's been very interesting, how the country as a whole doesn't want to seem to move sometimes on air and carbon restrictions, but you've got a lot of municipalities that are moving in that direction. And so you could be very directly affected. And once you take these different costs into account, all of a sudden the pricing picture looks very different. And I just gave you a generic example there, but I mean in the case of certainly in the cost of use, just think back very quickly. It's a refrigerator. Just think which one's more efficient in terms of cooling capacity and the electricity use during its lifetime. That may play a big factor. That's why they're starting to have the tags that are showing you, the level of efficiency. But it certainly could have to do with disposal costs or post-disposal costs, depending on what's in that particular product. Next slide. So in the end, we come full circle back. You start thinking, again, we're very much advocating that even though we're in the recycling end of the business, we need to have complete supply chain visibility, because we're completely hamstrung, literally, by decisions that are made further up the chain oftentimes. And some of the things we have to keep in mind here, there's a lot going on here. Certainly, there's increased demand for finite natural resources. I mean, it's no news to any of us. I mean, you've got the Chinese economy revved up, India. I mean, those are massive populations placing huge demands on materials, food, construction materials, oil, you name it. And when you have this demand on finite materials, at some point demand and supply lines cross, and you end up with shortages. And what the shortages mean are increased costs. The other thing we've talked about extensively here today has been the length of multiple supply chains. We've been on a real binge the last 20 years of getting our supply chains strung out everywhere. And most firms have extensive supply chains, very complex, multiple product lines, and there's going to be a cost here. Rich alluded to it earlier, just in transportation alone, an impact on carbon. The day is coming when those numbers are going to be included, and they're going to be calculated in there. And it starts raising some interesting questions for all of us, because it brings back that question of onshoring. And hey, would it, if you were looking at a total cost, as he just mentioned, would it make more sense to be doing something back here instead of being so strung out? And all the while, again, that level of complexity, again, it creates more risk, and because there's just more places where things are going on that you don't have visibility to. And I think about that, and I look at this garbage dump as a perfect example. Where I'm at in Oshkosh here, the city dump is going to be closing here within a year because it's full, and stuff is going to have to be transported out of the county literally now, because nobody wants. There's no place they can take that there's not a not in my backyard syndrome going on. They don't want another dump. And so that's the cost is going to go up for anybody. Forget the residential, yeah, that'll go up. But for any business here, if the more waste they have, their price to get rid of it at that end is going to get up. Now on the flip side of that, the proactive is one of the Native American tribes up here. They have a dump, and they've decided they're going to eliminate their dump, but they're going to go in it and they're going to start finding they're taking it apart piece by piece because they're finding so much in there that has not decomposed, and they're realizing there's a lot of value hidden in the landfill, and so they're going about it from that context. So actually, with that, oh yeah, go ahead.
Pete, let me interject something here. There's a company here in Pennsylvania that takes waste from steel mills and processes it, and they can extract a fair amount of metal. Now, also remember that the volume of this is relatively large, but they can extract a fair amount of metal, and if the nickel and the stainless prices are sufficiently high, they can actually make a pretty good buck by processing the scrap, or I shouldn't even say scrap. This is waste in terms of slag and other kinds of waste off of the steel mills. So you know, you're taking dirt and making product and actually profit from it.
Okay, next slide. Well, you guys could have some fun with this. This is I was telling them, I said it's almost like a Where's Waldo, but where's the waste in this picture? You start looking in here.
And for what it's worth, that's not one of my former plants.
Come on. But as you look at this picture, you start realizing that this is a very typical chemical processing facility or a refinery, and you start looking at here and you start wondering, where's the waste in this? You certainly know that you see a number of smokestacks, which is indicative of things going up in the atmosphere. It's interesting how in not so long ago, smokestacks were a sign of prosperity. I mean, like I said, companies would put their names on them. That's how proud they were that that's the business in there. And nowadays, a smokestack is seen as something you don't want near where you are, and it's a sign of outgoing emissions. And you see a number of things, obviously the steam sitting here. But one of the things Rich and I were taking when we were looking at this picture was, look at the amount of rust in this facility. And what is that going to imply in terms of issues later on? There's just any number. You see tanker cars down there being unloaded and knowing that they have to transit through undoubtedly heavy populated areas, and all that implies. So I mean, there's any number of things you start looking at. It's fairly easy to spot. And then I even think when I see a large facility, I start wondering, you don't see the parking lot. You wonder about the number of people that commute into your plant. One of the things I've done with a number of companies, we just look at the commuter. You look at their commuting patterns of your employees, particularly in a facility like this where they're going to be on shift work. You'd be amazed at how many of them are coming from the same place at the same time, and they're all driving their own cars. And so we don't think about little opportunities, even in the supply chain there, that could reduce costs. Next slide. So again, kind of summary, we're getting at this life cycle, and this idea that looking at the whole life cycle helps reducing, not just at one site, but once you get it reduced, it impacts the rest of the chain, is the idea. And vice versa, if we don't take care of it, these things are often shifted down the chain, and when we're down at the end, at the recycling end, we're dealing with it, and we're not sure what we have a lot of times. We've had a lot of issues along the way. And so we have to be very, very cognizant of asking questions of issues that are going on up the chain. I mean, if there's a message that comes out of today, it's we got to start getting more inquisitive about what's going on before it gets to us. Next. So one of our favorite terms, of course, are paradigms, and it's not 20 cents, but it's essentially a way of thinking. And the reality is that most companies really don't have a sustainable supply chain management strategy in place. We were talking about that prior to the broadcast. We don't tend to look very far out, and certainly in this context, we've got to be looking way out. And way out, I mean more than 10 years, probably 20 to 30 years out. And none of us tend to think that way when it's our business. And that's something that we've got to change. And again, Richard made the point early on, being more profitable, sustainable, and responsible, this is not a mutually exclusive deal. There's value to be had in this. There's a lot of value. And the concept of sustainability, as I said early on, means, hey, you're here. You're thriving. So we need to develop plans to operate in this resource-constrained environment, because we've been talking about that too. The reality is there are going to be constraints, and they're coming. And some of you may be impacted by them already, but there's going to be more regulations. There's going to be more issues going on. We're seeing that. We're in obviously a very dynamic time, even as we speak in this conference. I mean, you have to wonder what's going on in the European Union and what's going to happen there with all the defaults and everything. So it's not at odds. And, you know, it's interesting. It's very similar. We were talking about it because you think back to the quality movement. A lot of times people said the reason we can't do better quality, hey, it costs too much. We hear the same thing with a lot of times with these issues in sustainability. But as we learned with quality, hey, the design in, get it out, get that quality program in, it actually it results in a lot more benefit to your own bottom line. Next slide.
We started by asking what are the impediments. Actually, the one that probably heads my list and really endears me to my accounting faculty is traditional managerial accounting. If you look at how managerial accounting has developed over the last century, with the exception of activity-based costing, it probably hasn't. That statement gets me in a lot of trouble, but it's probably still an accurate statement. Much of traditional managerial accounting is based on labor hours, and if you look at the way product is valued, any kind of waste coming off of a process essentially is considered to have its value contained within the intended product, not within the waste stream, which leads us to the second bullet, that there's unrecognized value and opportunity in the residual stream. We just need to find a way to recognize it, because we could be sitting on top of a mountain of this and not even know it. Tell you one other war story, and that is there was an electronics company in New England that produced tantalum capacitors. They had a very sophisticated process for reclaiming all of the tantalum, which had a value of like about $125 a pound. If you looked around and you looked at their residual stream, it turned out that they had all the stainless steel carriers that were used as jigs to move product through the assembly line or the production line, and they just threw them away. Right? They said, "Oh, these things don't have any value because we've already used them." So finding a way to recognize that value has lots of opportunity. And actually, when I pointed out to that particular firm that scrap stainless is valuable, they kind of looked at me and they said, "Yeah, but we're getting all the tantalum." I said, "Yeah, but you're missing a lot of other stuff here too." I mentioned earlier about purchase price variance metrics. Looking at procurement activity in terms of certainly quality, certainly delivery, in addition to price, but then doing more due diligence on what your suppliers are doing, being able to consider issues like carbon emissions, length of supply chains, the time implications, and you saw that whole list that Steve put up earlier. What we find are that few firms are practicing end-to-end sourcing analysis. We're seeing more firms do this in a post 9/11 world, because if you're purchasing from off-street or offshore and you're doing it in any volume, you now have a requirement of explaining that to customs in order for preferential treatment on arrival. There's a process called CTPAT. customs trade partnership against terrorism that says if you can document your supply chain and do this for every one of your supply chains as a practice, you will have some time advantages. But then finally, the lack of information and transparency of materials in the chain. We're seeing this as better today than it had been in the past, but we have a lot of work to do. Steve, were you going to add anything to that?
Yeah, I like I said, I can't express it enough. I think all those are the detail things, but again, it's just this overall way of thinking and looking at our business from a holistic point of view and a long-term perspective. I mean, if we are going to be a sustainable firm, which I think most of us would agree we'd like to be, that means we're going to be here and we're going to be thriving. And if we're going to do that, we've got to extend the range of our thinking, and we've got to start looking up and down the supply chain, looking at these opportunities, looking at the design of everything that's in there, whether, you know, all the things we've talked about today. We've talked about the materials themselves. We've talked about the transportation. It could be the facilities. It could be the location of the facilities. It could be who we're sourcing with. There are any number of things, but we've got to start taking a long-term viewpoint of this and trying to incorporate these other different costs into the discussion that we currently do not have in the discussion, because that cost thing in the end is what influences people's decision making. We all know that. I mean, we can sit here and be as altruistic as we want, but in the end, we're looking at the economics of being in business, and so we need to make sure we've got these other cost factors in there. And that life cycle is a way to do it. As Rich said, you know, incorporating total cost analysis. I mean, I think if you take something away today, take away that viewpoint, that lengthy, holistic view, and out there much farther in terms of strategic planning than we normally do. Next slide. So in the end, we're back to this model, and this is what we've been talking about today. And like I said, I hope that's something that's been of value to you. I would certainly end my discussion. One of my favorite quotes was by a guy named David Brower, and one of the things he said, there was no business to be done on a dead planet. And I have no desire to be living on a dead planet myself. And so that's one of the reasons we're working hard in this area. The reality is resources are being used up at an unrelenting pace and an increasing pace, and it's largely due to the increasing population. These scientific things that you hear about, certainly with climate change and others, these are not political issues. These are life issues, and they're business issues and personal issues. And we need to start thinking that way, and we need to start, like I said, start thinking in a manner that incorporates this, because we'll be the better business people for having done this. And I truly believe that business people have to be a major part of this solution to this. Rich?
Okay. When you're looking at the I call it the sustainable supply chain differentiator. This is a score model, and we blew up that plan function because if you look at the score model and say, all right, my life cycle analysis as well as lean processes all get interwoven into this, but using a supply chain model for I'll say a unit of analysis is the thing that actually goes a long way to giving you visibility. We've thrown a lot of ideas out today, observations, a couple of war stories, but we think the point is that the supply chain, no matter what kind of residuals you're dealing with, is a useful approach to handling. Now, I'm looking at a couple of questions that are showing up here. Okay, finished? Go ahead.
Okay, this is Wayne Bowen again. If anybody has questions, they can use the dialog box that should be showing on your screen. We do have a couple questions here, and I'll start with them. Question here is, where is the largest population of manufacturing companies in the U.S.?
No, I don't know where you go with that. I tend to look at a finer at a finer level of analysis. I'm really fond at looking at what are referred to as industry clusters.
Yeah.
Industry clusters is where various groups of firms out of the same industry like to be located. I can look at northwestern Pennsylvania, where you have an industry cluster for powder metallurgy. It's probably the center for powder metallurgy on the planet. It's an all-in outgrowth of a company called Stackpole Resistor that started by pressing carbon powder with a binder material into a form to make resistors, and then other firms are saying, wait a minute, you can do this with powdered carbon, you can do this with powdered metal, and there's all sorts of substitutions for machined parts now using powder metallurgy technology. If I go further west into, I mean, we can pick places. The greater Toledo area is an industry cluster for the plastic molding industry. There's probably more plastic molding resin being shipped to the greater Toledo area than anywhere else in North America. The reason being is that supports the automotive industry. Pharmaceutical.
Well, I mean, I agree with you, Rich. I mean, it's a challenging question because you do end up with those clusters, and certainly, like where I live in northeast Wisconsin, we're a heavy manufacturing area. One of the, where we still do a lot of cutting and making of metal and products like that. We still have a lot of ties to the paper industry, but we've got a lot of manufacturing in this corridor called the Fox Valley here that runs literally from Fond du Lac to Green Bay, probably about 7,500 miles long, and that's certainly a cluster, and it's one that would apply very directly to the things we talked about today, because a number of these firms do source overseas. I'm working with one of them. I'm actually taking a tour of with 15 MBA students. We're leaving this week for China and Korea. That firm has manufacturing facilities in both of those areas, as well as suppliers, and they have products that are coming back and forth, into Wisconsin, from Wisconsin to there. Mexico is another supplier of theirs. It goes there, and sometimes before you get the finished product, it's gone back and across the Pacific Ocean 2 times to 3 times. And in my way of thinking, that's crazy in terms of the total cost. And yet, right now, from the economics that they're looking at, they see that as the best financial model. And I don't think it will be long term. That's one of the things we're talking about. We're trying to incorporate some of these other costs.
Okay, next question. Could you provide more information or example of purchase price variance metrics?
Actually, I have a good one, since everybody I think on the webinar purchases gasoline for a vehicle on a fairly regular basis. If you stop at a station and the price was $3.89, I want to say probably about maybe a month ago, and if you filled up this morning, it was, at least down the street from where I live, it was $3.59. My wife was with me, and she said, "Wow, we just saved 30 cents a gallon." And she multiplied it out times the 15 gallons, and she said, "Oh, we just saved $4.50." That in essence is the methodology that's used with purchase price variance. Can I buy it cheaper today than I bought it in the past? Now, in some respects, you can have market conditions that allow that to occur, but in other cases, the way firms get prices down is by buying in a larger volume. And that always winds up being an interesting discussion, because you've got the inventory manager down the hall that says, "Oh, wait a minute, I'm rewarded on how little inventory we have around here, not how much, and you want to be rewarded by how much you can save, so therefore you're buying more." You can see how suboptimality creeps into industrial decision making.
Well, it also creeps in because one of the factors that's in that price variance typically is that standard price. And back to the whole discussion we've had today, if that standard price doesn't incorporate the principles that we've been talking about from a total cost perspective, you know, your purchase price variance is going to be off anyways.
Okay, next question. How can a university campus procurement process reduce disposable shipping, packaging, example, universal pallets and cartons and tools?
So how can a university do it is the question versus anybody else?
Well, probably would apply to anybody else.
Yeah. Well, again, I think universities are an organization not unlike any, well, I won't go there, but they're different in some ways, but it's certainly in the operations context, they're no different than any operation. And part of that is an understanding at the purchasing level of the decision making in terms of where they're sourcing, who they're sourcing from, what they're getting, and that pallet thing is a classic example of something that you ought to be looking at. And again, I can give an example of where I'm at. I mean, on some things we're constrained by the whole UW system. We don't even have an input into what we do, whereas other items we do. And I suspect that the level of knowledge at that in terms of total cost is probably not crept in there yet. And it's a challenge here as it is in any organization. Rich?
I'm not so sure where that question came from, but several years ago I did some research for IBM Corporation. They have something called the Center for the Business of Government, and we actually benchmarked university procurement practices,
right.
And we found them to be sufficiently behind. This is going to make me really popular on campus. They're sufficiently behind the curve relative to what I find in the, certainly in the private sector, partly because of the metrics that are imposed. We still have university procurement people who are being rewarded, or at least given, given some positive feedback over the fact that they use purchase price variance.
Right, right.
The other thing there, if you look at the companies that supply universities, particularly places like Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin or Penn State, we're referred to as Research One universities. The things that go into operations like ours, certainly on the research end of it, I'm not going to even get into the maintaining the bricks and mortar for housing and food service, but actually feeding the research side of the enterprise. We happen to share a lot of the same suppliers that leading industry shares. And I would suspect that the way a university could really go about it is to engage in an open conversation with their suppliers about what can be done.
Well, I can give you an example of that. I mean, one of the things where a university now might get out ahead of business is when they start getting concerned about fair trade. For example, we have a fair trade committee here, and it typically has to do fair trade, at least for the university impact, with some of the food items we purchase. And I can certainly tell you that the food service providers that we've contracted with have worked very diligently with the school because they realize that as the university goes on that topic, the general population may go at some point. But we've been working on a number of items there. But there's no measurement that the procurement department is held to, other than you would have certain people on campus that would be getting quite vocal that we're not purchasing certain items, or that we are purchasing items that are coming from suppliers that they don't want to see on campus. So we have maybe more restrictions in that context.
Next question, why are pharmaceuticals not being recycled when not reusable?
Well, since I've actually had some firsthand experience with that.
Pharmaceuticals?
Pharmaceuticals, anytime, pharmaceuticals, not drugs, Steve, okay?
Okay, yeah, I misread the question, yeah, okay.
But I can tell you that an outdated pharmaceutical by law cannot be recycled. You can't even take the active ingredient grind it up and put it back in the process. It has to be disposed of as hazardous waste.
Well, well. Let me add on there. That's an interesting topic in that if you talk to municipal waste water sewage operators, they'll tell you that's probably one of the #1 problems they've got nowadays, are the number of pharmaceuticals that are being flushed literally down the toilet into their systems. It's getting to be a real challenge. So back to that total cost thing again. Here's a case of, again, when we've got waste somewhere in the supply chain, it's adding a cost to the whole that is not good. And that one is something you may want to look at on the local level, because they'll tell you that it's a real struggle to try and process that water, and that's your drinking water as well.
The other thing with the pharmaceutical industry, and that is that if you have a drug that's expired, sorry, if you have a pharmaceutical that's expired, one of the reasons why they expire is that over time they actually change in strength. In some cases they lose their strength, in other cases they gain in strength. And if you can imagine putting those back into the process and altering the strength of an intended drug, you wind up incurring probably a fair amount of cost and then producing off-spec material. But you know, Steve, you're absolutely right. When that stuff winds up in a residual stream, we wind up with a lot more undesired effects than than we can sit here and start and contemplate at the moment.
Well, yeah, it affects and cost. I mean, again, we want to keep it on that cost perspective. There is a cost, and it's incurred.
Okay, one last question. Any suggestions for a non-traditional accounting system other than ABC accounting?
I'm not sure quite how to handle that one.
I don't either, because I'm not an accountant by trade.
I'm not either.
You know, and I realized I was a severe critic here earlier in the webinar, you know, saying what didn't work without providing a reasonable solution for what might.
Well, you know, I don't know how to go about it, other than I would suggest again, take a strong look at this concept of life cycle accounting, total cost accounting, and how that would mesh in with ABC. That would be my gut feel, because again, I mean, we're looking at processes and we're looking at things there from that context.
I will say that in a lot of manufacturing plants, that if you put things into the dumpster and that dumpster is hauled away, the cost of doing so is an overhead item for the plant.
Yeah.
And all the products produced by that plant are sharing in that equally, which is really not an equitable way to look at it. So while the person who asked the question said that activity-based costing was not what they wanted to hear, that may actually be a useful way of looking at the disposition issue.
Well, especially, and again, if there's any reverse flow or anything like that, somehow getting it back incorporated into that original product cost is the key. I mentioned very first straight up doing a dumpster dive at my plant, and it was amazing when you started looking at things that were in the dumpster that you could tie back to a particular product line and then attribute that cost accordingly. You got very different profitability perspective than you would have had you not had that incorporated in there.
Okay, we're just about done. I just want to note that this webinar, like all the webinars in this series, have been recorded and will be available on both the National Recycling Coalition and Recycling Market Center websites. Again, thank you. We hope you'll join us next month's webinar scheduled for Monday, June 11th at 1:30 Eastern Time. Have a good day.